Hi AMP1 students. In this video we're going to start talking about the nervous system, and we will talk about the nervous system in the next few chapters. Specifically in this chapter, which is chapter 12, we're going to focus more on the nervous tissue, which includes the cells that make up the nervous tissue that's within our nervous system. So it's more going to be talking more about the microscopic anatomy of neurons and glial cells, which are cells that you'll learn about in this chapter too, that are part of the nervous tissue as well. They're the ones that kind of support and help protect the neurons, and the neurons are the ones that are actually sending impulses, nerve impulses or action potentials throughout the body so that the different parts of the body can communicate with each other. So we are going to first talk about the general functions of our nervous system. So when I'm going to use this picture here. When we're talking about the functions, general functions, we can break it down into three main primary functions that our nervous system is responsible for. So the first one is the nervous system is responsible for collecting information from the environment. So it may be in our external environment, or it could be internal environment too. So it's going to collect information, and how it does that is there's receptors located in our skin, for an example. So we'll have receptors in our hands, in our arms, legs. And the purpose of receptors are to detect any sort of change in the environment. We call it a stimulus if there's a change in the environment. So if we're talking about receptors in our skin, if we feel something hot, or we feel like a pinprick or some sort of pressure, we have receptors in our skin that detect that. And so they're collecting information. They're part of the nervous system, and they're collecting information from the environment. Now realize some of the receptors are located associated within the body, so like associated with our blood vessels or with our intestines, bladder, those kind of internal structures as well. And so there's receptors in them, so they're also detecting any sort of like stretching of the blood vessel, or any sort of acid in the stomach, things like that are being detected, and that information is also collected. So that's the first primary general function of the nervous system, is to collect information. And it does that through the presence of receptors that are present within the body. And so then the next function is kind of what follows that collecting of information, and that is that information that's collected is going to be sent to the brain and spinal cord, which is part of the central nervous system. So it'll be sent to the brain and spinal cord, and then the brain and spinal cord's function is to take all that information that's coming from the various parts of the body, and we say it's going to process it, it's going to evaluate it all, integrate it all, and kind of figure out what needs to be, what response needs to happen, if any response is necessary. So that's what the brain and spinal cord, which are part of the central nervous system, their primary role is to process and evaluate all this information coming in from the receptors and decide what the best response, if any, needs to be done. So that's our second primary function of the nervous system. And then the third one, which again follows the second primary function, is the brain and spinal cord. They will initiate a response if we need one, if it's required. And so they'll do that by sending a signal through the nerves of the body to effector organs of the body. So like it might be cardiac muscle, it's in the heart, maybe skeletal muscles in the arms or the legs, could be smooth muscle in the wall of the bladder, could be glands of the body. It's like thyroid gland, ovaries, things like that. But those are all generally called effectors. And so if we need a response because of some stimulus that the receptors picked up, then the effectors will kind of carry out that response under the orders of the brain and spinal cord, because they're serving as controlling these processes in the body. So those are our three general functions: collecting information, which is primarily the role of the receptors, and then processing and integrating all that information, which is the role of our brain and spinal cord, and then sending that initiating sort of a response to the effectors, and the effectors are going to cause that response or effect to happen. So that's how our nervous system generally works. We'll go into more details about how it sends signals from one area to the other. But that's generally what the nervous system is always doing all the time. So it's controlling a lot of our body processes, and it's also communicating between different parts of our body. It's kind of the main functions. The next learning objectives that we want to talk about have to do with how we describe the nervous system. It's a big body system. It's kind of complex, so it helps for us to kind of divide it into different parts, and a lot of times those different parts have different functions as well. So there's kind of two ways that we kind of organize the body system, so we can discuss it and think about it and how it functions more clearly. And one way is the structural organization. So we kind of break down the parts of the nervous system and into two major divisions or components. And you probably have heard of these terms. So one is the central nervous system, which we usually abbreviate CNS, and that includes the brain and spinal cord. They're in the center of the body. And then the other main part of the nervous system is the peripheral nervous system, which we also abbreviate most of the time PNS. And that includes the nerves that are coming to and from the brain and the spinal cord. So those are, in this picture, yellow. So all of these are part of the peripheral nervous system. So they say peripheral because it's more away from the center, more out from the center, so more the periphery of the body. So, and we'll talk about ganglion a little bit later in some other learning objectives. But those are the two main structural components or divisions that we use to describe the different parts of our nervous system. And then we also do it functionally. Oops, can't get that any higher. We also do it functionally. So if we're looking at the peripheral nervous system that has these nerves, if we look at the nerves and see what's running through them, we'll see that there's the neurons, usually the axons of the neurons, are running through those nerves. And so now some of those, so we'll take this nerve in the arm here. So some of the neurons, there are the axons of the neurons that are running in that nerve, maybe taking a nerve impulse or action potential towards the central nervous system or towards the brain and spinal cord. So if they're doing that, if we're getting like a receptor being, detecting some sort of change in the stimulus, and then we have this nerve and a specific neuron in that nerve that's taking the signal from that receptor to the brain or spinal cord, then we call those sensory. It's the sensory division of the peripheral nervous system. And so it's made up of the sensory neurons. That's the direction of their nerve impulses or action potentials. It's going to go from the PNS, where the receptors are, to the CNS, where the brain and spinal cord are. So then, because we have ones going in that direction, we also have to have ones going in the opposite direction. So going from the brain and spinal cord, or the CNS, to the peripheral nervous system, and specifically the effectors in the peripheral nervous system. So in that same nerve that we looked at before, we will have an axon of a motor neuron running through it, and then that action potential or nerve impulse is going from the brain and spinal cord to the CNS to an effector, say like a skeletal muscle in the forearm here, so like the brachioradialis muscle, we'll say. So that is called that's part of the motor nervous system. It contains motor neurons that are taking signals away from the CNS. So that's the main difference between the two main divisions of the peripheral nervous system, is some of those neurons are taking signals to the CNS, so we call them sensory, and some are taking signals away from the CNS, so we call them motor. All right, I'm going to make this a little smaller. There we go. Okay, so then we're kind of not done yet, because when we look at all those sensory neurons that are taking the signal to the CNS, it depends on, we will characterize those sensory neurons as either somatic or visceral. And basically somatic means that those sensory neurons are coming from certain organs of the body. And so in this case, they're coming from organs that we consciously perceive. So like from our eyes, from our ears, from our skin, we consciously perceive what we see and what we hear and what we feel on our skin. So they call those specific neurons, sensory neurons that are coming from the skin, eye, ear, they call them somatic sensory neurons. So they're going to work a little bit differently than our next type of sensory neurons, which are visceral sensory neurons. So the visceral sensory neurons are going to come from parts of the body that we don't consciously perceive or know that they're sending signals. So that's usually from internal organs. So from our blood vessels, our bladder, intestines, heart, those kind of things. So we call them visceral sensory neurons if they're coming from internal organs. And that's kind of viscera, that term viscera refers to internal organs. So that's why they call them visceral sensory neurons. All right, so those are the two types of sensory neurons that you'll see in the peripheral nervous system. And again, they're just different based on what part of the body they're bringing signals to the CNS from, so where those receptors are located. And then of the motor neurons that make up the motor division of our peripheral nervous system, kind of the same thing. Remember, these are taking signals away from the CNS, so they're going to effectors. So if they're going to the skeletal muscle, which is a type of an effector, we call them somatic motor neurons. So any motor neuron that's leaving the CNS and heading to a skeletal muscle to stimulate it, to contract, we call them somatic motor neurons. So these were the ones that we talked about in chapter 10 when we talked about skeletal muscle. And then we do have, though, motor neurons that are leaving the CNS and going to cardiac muscle, which is in the heart, smooth muscle, which is associated with internal organs, so like smooth muscles in the wall of the bladder and the uterus and the intestines and the blood vessels. So if we have motor neurons taking a signal to those particular muscles, cardiac and smooth, also glands, don't forget glands, so like your thyroid gland or your ovary, those kind of endocrine organs. We call them autonomic motor neurons. So these are the ones that we don't consciously control, so we call them autonomic. So I usually think of automatic when I see that word autonomic. So it's kind of something we don't consciously have to think about. Okay, so those are our two types of motor neurons, and they're different based on, what effectors they're taking a signal to. So. All right, so in the next video, we'll continue on with the objectives and learn a little bit more about the basics of our nervous system. So I'll see you in the next video.